today's session. Feel free to have your cameras on. It's great. When I'm interacting on workshops, I ask people to have their cameras on and they never do. You're just going to listen to me talk now, and it's great to see all the faces there. It's very strange. So it's nice to see you all. If you want your camera on, please do. But do have your microphone on mute if you can. And we did, somebody was talking this morning about somebody having Strictly on in the background, so it's a little bit disconcerting if you're listening to a television programme. Feel free to use the chat box if you've got any questions, anything that you want to ask. We have the chat box open, so as I go through what we're looking for today and some of the concepts, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have as we go through. And hopefully you've had a reminder through from Sophie, and she's talked to you about Kahoot. We're going to be running a quiz in the moment, so if you've not had a chance to yet, if you can either use the Kahoot app in your smartphone or go to www.kahoot.it so that we can actually make sure that you can fill the quiz in as well, and I'll go through those details in a moment. As I said, although this is more me sort of explaining the situation at the moment around modern slavery and what it is and how it affects you, I am happy to have a little bit of a chat with people in terms of the inbox, so feel free to put your questions in around that, or any comments or thoughts or observations you've got. It's interactive from that perspective. So what are we going to go through over the next sort of hour and a half? We'll do some introductions. I'll introduce myself so you know who the heck this woman is talking to you. We will do a little bit of a quiz in terms of getting an understanding of what you all know. So we'll see who's the smarties in the room, who's obviously going to benefit the most from today's content. We'll go into what we mean by modern slavery and look specifically at the Modern Slavery Act. And there are some changes happening with the Modern Slavery Act that have literally hot off the press over the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to give you some updates in terms of what that current thinking is. Then we'll go into some basic sort of things that you need to think about. So do you know what a victim looks like? Do you know how to spot those signs? Do you know what to do if you find a victim? Do you know who's around to support in those areas? And then this is only really an introduction session, so I'll give you a very quick overview of what due diligence looks like in an organisation. So thinking about what you have in place internally, but also then obviously within your supply chain. We'll hand over to Alice, who's then going to give you an overview of what Sir Robert McAlpine are doing in this space. And then I'll give you some tips and areas where you can go if you want to look and learn a little bit more, some areas of support. I'll finish off with any final questions. So without further ado, let's go into sort of the quick introductions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Carter. I've been working with Action Sustainability for 12 years, who run the supply chain school, and I've been with the school since it started in its early inception. I am a person who is very proud of being a procurement professional. There's not many of us around, but I do actually like being a procurement professional. But more recently, probably over the last 12 years, have looked more at sustainable procurement. And then over the last 5 years, probably looked at modern slavery, human rights and ethics in supply chains. I used to work for Carillion a long time ago, so vaguely aware of what goes on in construction in terms of the good, the bad, the ugly. But I'm going to give you some overview and insight into what's been going on around this within the construction industry. The session today is really about trying to increase your understanding, making sure you've got a basic level of understanding around what modern slavery actually is rather than what people perceive it to be, making sure you understand how and if the Modern Slavery Act applies to you guys and your supply chain. Due diligence is incredibly important regardless of what we look at in terms of the Act's requirements. So what does due diligence look like? And there is a session that we're looking at running later in December for SRM. That will go into that in a lot more detail and be more practical orientated, but we'll give you a good overview today. And then obviously any support, any tools, any things that you can take away. This is what we call a beginner. So we do assume that we have a number of people on here who might know a little bit about it or not an awful lot, but it's about limited or little knowledge. But I'm going to find out in a moment how much you all do know and who's the smart in the room. The session that we do in December around due diligence is more intermediate, so it's taking that level of understanding you've got from today and building on it. So this is sort of that journey that you can go on. So, quiz applications at the ready, so get your smartphone up and running, or use your IT. Use the Kahoot, and when you go into the app, you will need a PIN number. So on the screen, you will see a PIN number. If you put that into your Kahoot app, or alternatively into the internet search engine, if that's not the search engine, the Kahoot internet section. Feel free to put your names, although I did have some smart aleck the other day put me in as their name. I'm not sure who that was, but I can't actually work out who that is. I'm happy with nicknames as long as they're clean, but get your name in and then let's start going through. You guys have done this before. This is the quickest I've seen anybody put all their names in and do the codes. It's brilliant. Give it another 30 seconds, get more in, and then we can make a start. Okay. Fantastic. Let's get a couple more people. How many have we got on the call? 91 people on the call. Good God. Okay. I think this might go down as a record as the biggest Kahoot I've ever run so far, so I'm quite impressed. Okay, let's make a start. The first question is not a quiz, it's a poll. So don't worry, you won't be missing out if you're still logging in. From a poll perspective, I want you to categorise where you think your current knowledge of modern slavery is. Basically aware of the forms of slavery, but not about business requirements. You might be aware of forms of slavery and understand requirements. You may understand slavery, transparency requirements and have some experience. Or alternatively, you've got a really good understanding, and if I need to go and answer the door, you can take over. Ooh, okay. Okay, guys, we've got a good forms of slavery, but not clear about the business requirements. So this will help from that perspective. For those of you who understand some of the transparency requirements, this will verify. Nobody's brave enough to take over from me if the door goes, but I've got some people who've got some experience, so please feel free to share that. Right, when you get your app up, you'll need to pick the figure or pick the emblem that matches. And here's the first question. According to the Global Slavery Index in 2018, how many slaves are there globally? Red is 40 million, blue is 41 million, orange is 42 million, green is 43 million. How many do you think there are globally at the moment? Quick off the draw there, guys. Right, okay, only 6 of you got it right. It is 40 million. There are currently 40 million slaves across the globe, about 40.5 at the last counting in 2018. So well done to those 6 of you who got it right. Let's see who that was. Well done, Daniel, you're at the top. I'm assuring I've got more than one Daniel. Rob and Joanna, well done. Okay, question number 2. How many slaves did the Global Slavery Index estimate were in the UK in 2018? 13,000, 15,000, 136,000, or 250,000? Well done, well done. 136,000 is correct. When the Act came out in 2015, it was estimated there were about 13,000. That was significantly adjusted in 2018 to 136,000. The reality is, actually, we don't really know. It's a hidden crime, and the reporting metrics makes it quite difficult to calculate. The reality is we're probably quite close to 136,000. You may even increase that. The other thing to think about is what we mean by exploitation. So although we're talking about modern slavery victims, if we overlay paying below minimum wage, bullying, 0-hour contracts, all the things that come in terms of exploitation in our industry, you could probably times up by 10 in what's going on within our industry. So it's probably a drop in the ocean if we're thinking about it. Well done to those 29. Daniel, you answered that quickly. We've got some new names up there, Toby and Neem, if I've got that right, hopefully. This is where you try. True or false? The Modern Slavery Act only applies to businesses with a turnover of over 36 million. Quickest I've seen anybody answer. It's brilliant when I watch the numbers go up. You've all worked out your answer quick. Okay, the majority of you got that correct. It's false. The Act applies to absolutely everybody. So as you go down the supply chain, it gets harder and harder for the lower tiers where you have that direct connection with people who are being exploited. It is illegal for everybody and every organisation to exploit. What the 36 million, and I'll go through that in a moment, is linked to is your statement requirements, the fact that you have to have a statement. Okay, next question. Daniel, you are on fire. Okay, well done. We had a couple of new ones. Well done, James and Darren. Okay. The Modern Slavery Act has a definition of modern slavery. Which of these is not considered modern slavery within those definitions? Forced labour, criminal exploitation, arranged marriage, or money laundering? Well done, the majority of you got that correct. And it is funny, every time I run this quiz, the other highest question that comes in is arranged marriage. There are aspects in the Modern Slavery Act where there are things like arranged marriage, organ harvesting. They are also categorised under the Modern Slavery Act. So people who are trafficked into the UK purposely for the opportunity to harvest their organs, they are categorised underneath the Modern Slavery Act as well. And arranged marriage is also part of that within the UK. But money laundering obviously is not one, although be aware that there are connections with exploitation and criminality that include things like money laundering. And the biggest prosecution around car washes was in Milton Keynes, where they actually raided a car wash in an old garage station. They found victims of slavery, £2 million in laundered money, I think, and drugs and guns. So it's usually a nice combination of ways of maximising the profit for the criminals. Oh, Toby, you knocked Daniel off the list. Okay. Question number 6. From the total number of global slaves, what percentage is attributed to forced labour? So out of those 40 million, how many of them are in forced labour, which is a part of modern slavery? 68%, 10%, 22%. Well done, majority right again, 68%. 10% is attributed to what we call government exploitation. So that's like countries such as Afghanistan, where they force their patrons in their country to work on cotton farms. You could even argue the US penal system potentially has exploited prisoners being used to subsidise products that are exported across the globe. The 22% is linked to sexual exploitation, to prostitution, which isn't as high as you think. That's what people tend to think of. Okay, James, hope you've disappeared off. Daniel, you're still up there. Well done, Robin, Lee, and Carl. Come on, ladies. What percentage of forced victims are linked to the construction industry? So out of that, 3/4. Which industry, or how many in our industry? So 20%, 15%, 18%, or 2%? Ooh, more diverse on here. Well done to the 21. It is 18%. It's around about 2.5 million victims of slavery work in construction. That isn't just working on our sites. That isn't just, I mean, I'm a football fan. That isn't just Qatar and the World Cup and those sorts of venues, big projects, but it's also in things like our slate, our bricks, the sorts of products, the timber, the steel, the sort of materials that we purchase on a regular basis, and that's 18%. Quite a high number. Well done. Okay. Modern slavery is basically profitable. That's why it works. What is the estimated income generated for criminal enterprises through slavery? 80 billion, 100 billion, 150 billion, or 200 billion? Well done. A lot of you got that right. 150 billion. It's more money than the tobacco industry makes. It's more money than the US banking system makes. And if we're looking at profitability, the most profitable region globally for exploitation is Europe. So a lot of you might be thinking about minimum wage, living wage, paying those sorts of issues, paying those sorts of standards. I always ask organisations to think about one more check. It's fine to say that you pay minimum wage, living wage, national wage, even better than that. But with exploiters, ensure that that money gets into the pockets of the individuals who are doing the job. That's why Europe is profitable. So we can say we pay all this money, but if it doesn't get into the hands of the people who are earning it, then actually it's just money that's going into criminal enterprise. So well done. Oh, got some more ones on there, some more names. Daniel's holding on. Right, puzzle. In 2019, place these industries in order of the highest to the lowest number of reported cases. So which industry had the most, which had the least, and the bits in the middle. So construction, car washes, hospitality, or beauty and spa, nail bars, those sorts of things. Some of you are struggling with this one. So this gets most people, to be honest. Let's see how you do. Oh, not quite. The highest I've had is 8% correct on this. So the biggest cases in 2019 were in car washes. Over 1,000 victims found in 2019 reported in. Nail bars, spas, beauty areas. So gentlemen, when you're getting ready for Christmas, make sure you're looking at where you're getting nails done. Construction being the third highest sector, potentially 500 victims identified last year that have been reported. And hospitality, we're talking events, we're talking restaurants, those sorts of areas where people are being used. Obviously, COVID's had an impact on some of those. So where some industries have closed down, we've seen victims move to different industries. But in car washes are one to look out for. So on a personal level, if you ever go to one of those side streets and get your car detailed for less than £5, law enforcement reckon that is almost 100% guaranteed that you're having that done by victims of exploitation. So just be aware when you're having things like your car washes and your nails done on a personal level. How are we doing? Too much of a move there. That one always stumps everybody. Which of these are signs displayed by victims of slavery? They appear withdrawn, they might show signs of physical abuse, they might have some sort of PTSD, or they could have all of them. Which do you think are signs? Well done, the majority correct. Always look as an organisation at the soft signs as well as the hard sort of process signs. So yes, you'll need to check things like passports, checking like phone numbers, but look for the softer sides of things in terms of what victims display, and they can show a lot of these. A lot of organisations think about connecting them with mental health first aiders, because actually you will see individuals displaying signs that are linked with people who are depressed, who are isolated. So well done to the majority of those that got that right. So last two are a poll. In your organisation, if you find somebody, do you know who you should be calling? I don't mean Ghostbusters. I just realised what that sounds like. Who should you be ringing? Brilliant. Okay, so there's good awareness around the Modern Slavery Helpline. A lot of you are calling those numbers, which is great. Whistleblowing helplines, also a good route to use. My word of warning around whistleblowing helplines is make sure that when you ring them, or these systems are set up, they know what to do. A lot of people don't necessarily train their whistleblowing teams, think about who to connect with. And obviously that provides victims with a bit of a problem in terms of how quickly they can get help. Yes, it's also recommended you ring 999. There's also an organisation we'll talk about in a moment called the Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority, the GLAA. They are also a good organisation to contact. For those of you who don't know, my one challenge to you at the end of all of this is to go back to your organisations and find out who to ring, so that you're aware if you do see anybody displaying these signs. Okay, last poll question, and then we'll see who are the winners and the scores on the doors. Has your organisation got a modern slavery statement? No, you're not legally required to. We have, I think, but I haven't read it. We have one, but it's written by somebody somewhere in a department, or we have a statement, but it's developed by a number of departments. So your procurement, your legal, HR, those sorts of guys. Wow, you guys are quite sophisticated. That's good. In terms of maturity, when we get onto the statements, you'll start to see that it should be a multiple department that runs it, that creates it, because it's all sorts of organisations that get involved. Those that aren't legally required to, do you know what? Maybe I'll think about doing it anyway. If you have to put all your due diligence in place and think about these things, you might not be required to, but it might help you win work too. So let's have a think about how that could work. So let's have a look. See who's on the podium. Hopefully you can recognise yourself. Right, well done, Rob, even though there's probably about 20 of them. You're third. Lee, you're second. And at the top, well done, James. And coming up, sort of runners up, we've got Carl and Toby. So well done, gentlemen. You've all done well. Let's see if we can explore some of those concepts in a little bit more detail. Right, so modern slavery, what is it? We've talked through some of those areas in the quiz, but it's always important that we understand why we're doing this. And this, hopefully, will show you. No, it won't, because it's going to be a pain.
I needed to earn enough money for my daughter for her school, and I was told about a good job in England, so me and 2 others took it. We were picked up and driven to a port. We went on a ferry to England. When we arrived, they said we were going to work for good money, so we worked very hard for long hours to finish the job well. But when we finished, we never got paid. Instead, we were locked up. They forced us to do more work. They would beat us and threaten us if we didn't finish the work. We couldn't go anywhere because they took our passports, ID, and money. We were stuck. I felt hopeless, totally powerless. At this time, I knew I was a slave. I felt very sick, hungry, and tired all the time. I was sold from person to person, bartered for right in front of my face. I heard a man say I wasn't even worth 300. I felt worthless, like rubbish on the floor. I wished that I could die, that it could all be behind. I finally decided I would rather be killed trying to escape than stay. I knew one man who lived a long way away. I had no money or transport, so I had to walk as fast as I could, or they would catch me. My legs are bad because they beat me, but I had to keep going. I walked for 10 days straight with no stopping. Look, these are the shoes I found. They are the wrong size, but they are all I had. When I was walking, all I could think about was the traffickers. They are chasing me. They will find me. I was very worried. I thought of my daughter too. I had let her down so much. I felt shameful. Hope for Justice have been very good to me. I didn't expect any help. I thought I was finished. I am so happy to be free, to be alive.
It's always important to remember that the Act was created exactly for that reason, that we are looking at making sure that we are helping victims. So any response that your organisations are doing, anything that you're looking for has to be what we call victim-centric. How do we help people to make sure that they're not in that situation? The biggest case we've seen so far in the UK was Operation Fort at the beginning of this year. I don't know if anybody saw the hunt for hidden slave gangs, where they focused on this. I'm a Midlander, up in sort of on Trent Way, Stafford Way, and it was all around my region in West Brom, in Birmingham. It was a family and some individuals that were bringing over people from Poland, Romania, taking them from homeless shelters, taking them from the streets, taking them from prison, and they'd exploited in the UK over a 2-year period, potentially up to 400 victims. They made £2 million in income, and they were working through a legitimate recruitment company who had an individual who was the only Polish speaker, Eastern European speaker, who was able to then manipulate where they went and where they went to work under the guise of being a genuine organisation. And they worked on farms, they worked on building sites, they worked in factories. That's the biggest case we've seen so far in the UK. All 8 of them were given a total of around about 50 years in prison for their prosecution, and they're still trying to find 2 of them that went on the run. So this is what we need to be thinking about. Also, you will see lots and lots and lots of videos about victims. They all seem to be Eastern European. Don't quite know why. They are a very, very strong proportion, unfortunately, of victims who are trafficked into the UK. Behind that, in terms of geographical profile, you are also seeing a large number of Vietnamese and Chinese that are being trafficked into the UK. The Vietnamese are being used in cannabis farms and farms. And also the third highest is English residents, homeless people or vulnerable people who are being exploited. So don't fall into the trap that think it is just all the Eastern Europeans. Actually, we've got it from all over the globe being trafficked into the UK. As we've mentioned, in terms of the forms of slavery, you will see the main ones as an organisation you should be worried about. The forced labour, usually associated with that is something we call criminal exploitation. There used to be a trait where the exploiters would look at working people for a really long period of time, lots of overtime, and then they realised that actually they could overlay quite easily sort of credit card debt, benefit fraud, insurance fraud, fraud within your own organisations. I've spoken to a supply chain director of a very large principal contractor who found a security guard on his site. He had the security guard who was a victim, but then they had all sorts of fraud going on in the background around invoicing and timesheets and all those sorts of areas. So criminal exploitation usually goes hand in hand with forced labour, and law enforcement do point to that. And interestingly, although I don't think we've got a massive problem with sexual exploitation, if you're working away on any of the sites, so I did some work a few years ago on the A14, and the supply chain manager was very open and honest about the fact that he had got modular accommodation with lots of people working away from home. He wanted to look at his FM contracts, because if he'd got potentially female slaves being used, doing all the cleaning every night, and then being sold across into the modular accommodation, prostitution or sexual exploitation, they would do that. And the key here is to remember that as far as exploiters are concerned, these are assets. And we're familiar with the term of sweat the asset. Well, they will sweat the asset. They will find any way they possibly can to maximize the amount of money. They call them horses. There's a very good video. I'll send it out with I'll remember Sophie to send me the link to the horse trading video. And the horse trading video really talks about it from the perspective of an exploiter. They can hold houses of 10, 15 people, and each individual can bring them in an annual income of around about £30,000 to £40,000. So each house they own could be bringing in £300,000, £400,000 a year for them, in terms of that income that's coming in. So be aware of the fact that you can categorise them, but there is an overlap sometimes in the way that they do that. In terms of where we find exploitation, agriculture is still a problem. We saw the effect of COVID and the fact that we didn't have workers because we closed the borders. We also saw the effect that we ended up with a situation where we were transporting people in from abroad because we didn't have the resources internally either. There is still a big problem in agriculture due to the transient nature of the way that we have the workforce and the peaks and troughs that we get in demand. There's also something called conflict minerals you may or may not be familiar with. These are things that are in our smartphones, in our ICT, in our laptops, our tablets, and a large majority come from something called the Congo, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. I always get that the wrong way around. And they are mined by children who've been kidnapped and also forced to work as child soldiers out in guerrilla warfare in those areas. Interestingly, that's a problem that's been around for about 20 to 30 years. And also the fact that we've actually now started to get the likes of IBM and Intel starting to try and take responsibility in this area. So it's really, really interesting how the landscape's changing now, slowly and surely. There's something called blood bricks. I don't know if anybody had any problems with brick shortage. I know there was brick shortages, there was plasterboard shortages during COVID. South Asia has a large problem with climate change, and they've started to see farmers who can no longer farm and are no longer providing agriculture, having their debt bought by kiln owners who then bring them into the kilns, and the conditions in their working in are horrendous. And because they bought their debt, they're in debt. It's debt bondage. It was a problem that most people go, oh, that's just Southeast Asia, that's their problem. To a certain extent, we hear a lot of that. But what's interesting is that recently there's been something like a 300% increase in exports to the UK from South Asia and from these kilns. So in terms of that responsible sourcing, we need to start to think about where that transparency goes and where the mapping goes, and are we getting bricks from abroad and what are the conditions. Everyone's probably familiar with Boohoo. I don't know if anybody's got anything from Boohoo, but in terms of the clothing and Leicester, there's been a massive, massive impact. Ironically, when you look at the Boohoo scandal and the effect that it had on the share price, there was no exploitation in terms of modern slavery, but there was actually a lot of exploitation around basic lay standards. That knocked 70% off their share price, and in fact impacted Leicester even worse, because lots of organisations started to think about pulling out of Leicester because they weren't convinced that the industry was looking at these issues seriously. But it isn't just Boohoo. We've had Top Glove with the PPE. You've had Primark, you've had Nike, you've had Adidas, even Marks and Spencers, who are seen as the most sustainable, finding opportunities for exploitation in their supply chain being found by criminals, particularly around Syria as well with Marks and Spencers. Domestic servitude, probably one of the worst, most harrowing cases I've seen of this actually was an individual. There was a couple down in Southampton. They were a doctor and a teacher, and they'd been keeping an individual in their garden shed for 25 years. He'd been in their shed for 25 years. He'd been cleaning their house, maintaining their house. He'd been living in a sleeping bag with a bit of food being thrown his way. I don't know what's more disturbing is the fact that somebody would even do that, or the fact that he'd been living there and none of the neighbours had pointed that out. It's kind of harrowing on all sorts of levels. People are being trafficked into the UK to provide cleaning services at people's houses, nanny services, all those sorts of areas, and it's quite a lucrative trade. As I've mentioned, gentlemen, if you want to get your nails done, ladies also think about this, but there is a problem with nail bars particularly. The prosecutors on iPlayer, if you can find that, watch it, it's very fascinating. Again, Burton-on-Trent had one of the biggest raids at the moment on nail bars and the use of Asian immigrants that were being trafficked in or exploited when they found themselves over here. So that is an area that is currently being considered, and I think it was number 2. Mentioned car washes. We're not talking about your usual ones that you go to. In most cases, they're not exploited. We're usually talking about the ones that turn up and then disappear. They'll move around from place to place, down side streets, try and keeping very low key. But there is an app that law enforcement use that you can download where you can report suspicions of any victims in a local car wash. Might be worth having a think about. So that you can report it to law enforcement and they can go investigate. They need our eyes and ears. And then construction. Construction's under the lens and has been since the app came out. I remember in the early days when I was talking to law enforcement, I asked them what they meant by construction, because that's a very big word for a very big industry. Very small word, sorry, for a very big industry. And the perception was that it was in Qatar, it was in the Middle East, in areas where a lot of the big developments were being done, or it was the illegal tarmac drivers who come in and do the cash and hand job for you on your drives. Actually, one of the worst cases was the Rooney family. I'm not talking about Wayne Rooney. I'm talking about a family of travellers who got, I think it's about 35 years. And also to ensure, sorry, they were taking individuals homeless and they were torturing them as well as using them on paving and everything. Family of 3, I think, and they got about 30 years. That's the most graphic and horrific that I've seen. But actually, I know over my last 5 years, I can count on both hands the number of times that I've had people reporting on infrastructure projects, on building projects, and not down to tiers. It's higher up as well. So construction has a problem in varying degrees, and we need to be very much aware of this. Thanks, Alice, for that. As I mentioned, when we talk about exploitation, there is something that you need to consider. Modern slavery is the most extreme form of exploitation, and it is covered by the app. But as we're starting to understand more about how business operates and how businesses deal with people, we start to understand that exploitation is bigger than just modern slavery. We start to think about how do we treat people in our supply chain. So think about your construction sites, think about where you're working. You may not see anybody who is forced labour or debt bondage or false imprisonment. You might not see any of that, but you probably will know somebody who's below minimum wage. You will know somebody who potentially is having hidden payments on PPE that maybe they're being charged, that's forcing them to think about that. You may be thinking about, oh, there may be people that are basically breaching all sorts of contracts. You might see bullying, discrimination, violence, late payments, no payments, retention. We've seen it all. Our industry is a lot better than it used to be. Trust me, I mean, you all know that. But it's still got a long way to go, ensuring that everybody is treated fairly in that supply chain. So the exploitation spectrum is really important to understand. And modern slavery happens because it can fester in an industry that it has a certain level of exploitation, acceptable behaviour, as acceptable behaviour. So there is a big trend at the moment to think about moving away from, I just need to make sure I'm complying with the Modern Slavery Act, to more generally thinking about how can we make conditions better for our industry, especially as we have a little perfect storm coming up with skills, you know, diversity, all those sorts of other issues that are interrelated. The other thing to think about, as a procurement person, these things really annoy me sometimes, the contractual structures that we have, the vulnerability we have built into the way we operate as an industry, the fact that we subcontract everything and then we sub everything and pass the risk down to the supply chain, the fact that we do have this widespread agency labour type approach to the way that we work, that we don't work collaboratively on a lot of projects. We are getting better, and there's some really good examples of where that has happened. And in fact, where that has happened, there has been great correlation with productivity improvement and delivery on time and everything else that we all hold dear to our hearts in construction. But we need to understand that there are certain things that we do as normal practice that can make our industry attractive to criminal exploitation. One particular example I had, it was an infrastructure client. They rang me This infrastructure client, I know, is impossible. I thought it was impossible to get on any of their sites without all documentation, because they're very, very health and safety orientated. This individual rang me and they'd found somebody who didn't speak English, hadn't got the right PPE, wasn't actually contacting anybody. They potentially might have found a victim of exploitation, but what was more worrying was the fact that on site, it was 2 weeks after they'd found the individual that they rang me, so by then it's too late. But what was even more important was they didn't know which subcontractor they were connected to. So the fragmentation of the way that the projects work mean that that person had turned up on site and was slipping through the net, but fundamentally nobody knew who he was or who he's connected to. So we have to bear that in mind in the way that our systems work. The other thing as well is there is reputational risk. Now, I'm brutally honest here. We are not Nikes, we are not Adidas's. Our reputational risk is relatively minimal in comparison to something that has a brand. And in fact, if you start to look at some of the materials that you're purchasing, when there's a very strong brand associated with it, you will see that they really do push the boat out in terms of trying to deal with these issues. So the reputational risk is not as massive in our industry because we are very cloak and dagger in the way we operate, and our supply chains aren't very transparent. But there is daily focuses on modern slavery in media, in social media, on Twitter, in, you know, out in that big wide world. The human rights issue is under a lens and is not going away. We found literally last year, although I'm still looking at some new ones, shutting down factories after potential. There was obviously the trafficking that was going on. So we had the court cases going on at the moment with the Vietnamese that were being sort of smuggled into the UK and they were obviously killed. We've had up on the M5, my neck of the woods again, 29 people found in the van, potential victims of modern slavery. Mentioned the blood bricks and the increase in the construction boom globally and how we're profiting from that. But it's not just construction. I'm a massive foodie, and it's actually a massive problem now to go shopping and trying to work out where you get your food from and how it's important. And at the risk of sounding really middle class, avocados are a nightmare because you've got Israel, you've got Egypt, you've got the fact that avocados are funding drug cartels in Mexico, you've got strawberries in Spain, you've got, seriously, if you want to go on a diet, just go on an ethical diet, you'll never eat anything. So think about how you're looking at the sourcing side of things, because within a lot of our supply chains, it's impossible to stand here today as individuals on this call, and as individuals to be able to say that we are not consuming something, eating something, using something that has slavery involved. We will all be doing it without necessarily knowing about it. So it's an important thing to remember in terms of our personal consumption. The other thing that's really interesting is, I'll go through the Act in a moment, but you'll see that there is opportunities in the Act for compensation. And in fact, there is a very, very, very large civil suit which will have massive ramifications for supply chains if it goes through, with the families of children that have been working in the cobalt mines who've died. And they are currently suing Microsoft, Dell, Tesla, all of the individuals who are profiting significantly from all the innovations that are coming out of all these products, for abuse and exploitation of children that are being used in that mine. If that goes through, that has massive ramifications for the supply chain. But as you can imagine, it will take a while to go through with the legal system as it is. But these sorts of things are popping up more and more now. Also, Nike, Apple, BMW are amongst a number of brands that are using Muslim slaves in China. You'll see human rights breaches every day now in anything that we're looking at in terms of consumption and the things that we're buying on a regular basis. So now I've depressed you. Now I've told you how terrible the world is. The good thing is that we can do stuff, and we can actually start to get the conversation and the awareness raised. And I think that's the most important thing you can take from any of these. I deliver these courses with a smile on my face, not because I'm psychotic, but because I'm actually quite optimistic that if we raise awareness and we get people talking about these issues, we can start to make small baby steps to improving the situation. And the Act has helped us do that. The Act has got lots of challenges. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it's got the conversations going, which is important. So as we've mentioned in the training and the quiz, sorry, it's important to note that the Act applies to everybody. It's illegal to traffic. It's illegal to exploit. If and I think it's section 6 of the Act, individual victims have the right to claim compensation. The only time this has currently been successfully done is in July 2016 when the Act first came out, and the first company that was prosecuted under the Modern Slavery Act was the Happy Chicken Farm. Obviously the chickens were happy, but the people picking the eggs weren't that happy. And they were found guilty of exploiting 6 Latvian workers, and they were ordered to pay £1 million in compensation to those Latvian workers. Now, it's easy to create that sort of connectivity, that one-to-one, so the compensation was relatively straightforward. But I liken this to the corporate manslaughter legislation, thinking about the fact that at some point somebody's going to go for the big whale and go for the big organisation that has done everything in its power to ensure that exploitation can quite happily thrive and not deal with those issues, complicity being those issues. So that element is in there at the moment. It's not been utilised a lot, but just be aware that that is a potential risk for your business, even from a financial perspective. As I mentioned, the Act has 7 parts. The first one being it's an offence. It's an offence to traffic. It's an offence to exploit. It's an offence to steal vehicles with the view to traffic. It's kind of weird, the amount of things that they put in there. But one of the things that's important to note is that the offences now carry a potential life sentence. So it used to be 14 years, it's now a potential life sentence. There are things called preventative orders, and I've seen the first one of these issued this year actually, where law enforcement, they're not quite sure that you're exploiting, they can't quite prove it. So what they do is they hit you with a preventative order, which basically stops you doing your business. We can't prove you're exploiting, therefore we're stopping you acting in that activity. So be aware that there may be these sorts of things in place in the supply chain. Enforcement for ships is quite interesting, particularly if you're buying any materials. So there is an opportunity, again, this hasn't really been used yet by law enforcement, where a ship can be taken over by the Home Office and put into dock, and everything on there stays if there is a suspicion of trafficking going on within those areas. So obviously from a logistical perspective, that has impacts as well. We have an anti-slavery commissioner. She's very busy, Dame Sarah Thornton. She goes around the country working with businesses, trying to work out how to address these issues. And the statement I'm going to go into in a moment, that's probably the thing that you need to be more aware of than anything else. The 2 things to be thinking about are the protection of victims. And that's where the clause around compensation exists. So that's where you do have that potential chance of compensation being cleared if you've not made sure that exploitation doesn't happen. So your due diligence needs to be in place. But also, we'll go in later on around how victims are controlled. They use the threat of law enforcement to keep them in line. We will report you to local authorities. And actually here, anybody undertaking any criminal activity will be immune for prosecution if they're being controlled by exploiters, if they can then help those exploiters come to power. So victims are protected, that element is taken away as a control mechanism. Admittedly, victims won't know that, but it's a way of being able to gain their trust. And then the other one that you need to be aware of is the GLA. So the GLA was usually the Gang Masters Licensing Authority. That was originally what it was called. They were created off the back of the Morecambe Bay cockle pickers disaster and all those people that died, or those Chinese individuals who died. They never really touched construction. They're very much agriculture, retail, manufacturing. But they now have a new name called the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority. And they have power over construction in terms of the fact that they can come into any of your sites where there are any potential victims of slavery and help those individuals, take them to safety, work with law enforcement and build the prosecution against the people who are controlling them. So you need to be aware of them because they have powers now to come into any of your businesses if they feel that there is any potential for exploitation. There's still no licensing arrangements. It's not like the licensing arrangements in labour agencies are still separate. It's not in construction at the moment. Although obviously, if we don't get our house in order in construction, that might come. That might eventually come. The other thing to note is that the GLAA, so many acronyms, they are currently under review again with the view to moving to what we call a single enforcement body. So the single enforcement body will bring the GLAA, the Home Office, tax, DWP, all those organisations that have anything to do with the sort of labour standards associated with people. They'll bring them all together so that they can come onto a site and basically say there may not be exploitation from a modern slavery perspective, but there's definitely breaches in tax, there's breaches in payment mechanisms, and that's a new body that's under discussion at the moment that might be being created next year. And if that comes in, that has bigger implications again for us as businesses. So some of you mentioned that you've got modern slavery statements, which is great. There are transparency and supply chain guidelines that are in place. They were in place when the Act first came out in 2015. If we're brutally honest right now, this is the biggest weakness of the Modern Slavery Act. To do a statement, you need to do 6 things. Simply need to do 6 things. You need to have a statement visible on your website, and by visible I mean 1, 2 clicks, not 20 clicks buried somewhere in the bottom. You do need to have the £36 million threshold as the sort of starting, and all you have to say is what actions you've taken to combat slavery. And you can even say, I've done nothing and I don't care. Good luck reputationally, but you can say that and still be legally compliant. It needs to be signed by directors and it needs to be approved by board. At the moment, compliance with this element of the legislation is around about 40% of businesses that should be reporting are currently reporting. It's dire in terms of the amount of compliance that's going on in this space. They did provide some guidelines on what you should be thinking about, and we can cover those in a bit more detail in your due diligence. But a good statement should talk about what your business looks like, what its structure is, what its size is, what sectors you operate in, more importantly, what risks you have. So one of the things to take away from today is that you're not expected to suddenly create a big, wonderful world and solve all the world's problems. Great if we could, but we can't. What you have to do is look at where your risks sit as an organisation. And an example of this was an SME that came and spoke to me after a workshop that I was running. He picked up on the PPE I was talking about and the fact that China has got some bad reputations on labour standards. He was a tiling company, and he said to me, Helen, how do I deal with PPE? I don't know what's going on in China. How do I do that? And I'm not going to know that. The reality is that's not his risk. He's a tiling company, so he has slate. He has other products that potentially have got a bigger risk for him because it's fundamental to the way his business operates. So actually he needed to be focusing on where he was getting his slate from, his manufacturing slate to be able to produce his tiles, rather than worrying about his PPE. There are things he can do around PPE. He can talk to his client and collaborate with them, work out what the standards are, come off the back of an arrangement. You can be creative, but that's not his area of focus. His risk needed to be about where he was going to be getting things like slate from. The same with organisations. Some of you may not actually employ transient labour or temporary labour. You may not have labour agencies that you work for if you're a subby on here. You may just do everything 100% directly employed, in which case don't worry about labour agencies, because that's not your risk. That's not what you should be thinking about. So the risks are always a profile that you need to be thinking about. What policies you have, what KPIs and what measurements you have in place. KPIs, by the way, are not how many victims you've saved. They are how much of the supply chain have you worked with, how much training have you done, how much awareness have you done. It's not about the sort of interventions that you can go into, although marshals are a really good example of what's going on in a statement. They do now actually report on how many whistleblowing instances there have been, but admittedly they've been doing this for about 15 years, so they're quite mature in this space. So don't think you have to be reporting that yet. That shows you've really got a good handle on what's going on. Remediation and grievances I'll go into in a bit more detail, and then what training. Not just training like this, but training for all your teams. Have you done training with your site teams? Have you done training with your board? Do your board know what the heck's going on and what the reality of modern slavery is? The guidelines are not mandatory, but they are a really, really good way of structuring a statement and making sure that you're really understanding what's going on within this space. So if you're not using that structure, do use that structure. And the reason you need to is because it's coming as mandatory anyway. So the government reviewed the legislation. There was a lot of criticism over the legislation in as much that people weren't complying, weren't doing statements. Statements were 3 lines long saying, yeah, we've done some stuff. And it wasn't really making the step change necessary. So what's happening is that the government has made some announcements on the 22nd of September. Everything that I put in the guidelines that I talked you through is now mandatory. That's exactly what you've got to include in the statement. The timings of the statements are now uniform. So every organisation that's legally obliged to report has to report at the end of October after an April financial year end. If your financial year is different, it doesn't matter, it's still the same timing. Publication now has to be on a central government database, so the government can see who's complying and who's not. And the approval has to be visible from board, so it's not just yes, it's ratified, it has to be physically, names have to be written on it, directors have to be written on it. The other thing for any of you working in the public sector is now included. It didn't used to be. So you may have some public sector clients that are already quite hot on this. There are other public sector clients who aren't. But local authorities, for example, are now trying to work out how to grapple with this. They traditionally haven't really picked this up yet. So there will be more coming through your PQQ questioning that you might see if you're working directly for any of those guys. There was one final recommendation that was made, mainly for those of you who don't know, the Australian legislation came out last year, and in there are penalties of up to $3 million for organisations who fail to comply. The recommendation was that anybody who fails to comply should also be penalised in the UK, and there should be fines. The government has decided right now not to do that. I think obviously they're worried about businesses in general and how they're going to operate. But once this single enforcement body comes in, it will be up to them to determine whether you could get penalised financially for failing to comply with the legislation. So there is a little bit more teeth coming in terms of compliance with those areas. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm going to take a quick breath. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick 5-minute break, mainly because I just need to go and get a glass of water. I'm losing my voice. I'm going to let you guys go and get a cup of tea as well. So if you can get back here for 11:05, and then what I will do is go into how we spot the signs, the things that you need to do at a local level. So get back here for 11:05, and I'll go into the signs and the due diligence, and we can wrap up for the last 45 minutes. Yeah? Go for it, guys. Right, so we've gone through the Act, we've gone through what modern slavery is. Let's have a look at how we spot the signs. What was good from the quiz was that you guys have got a good understanding. So this should be what you know. Now, bear with me a minute because I want to make sure that the volume is right. It's a really interesting video. Some of you may have seen it, you may not, but it's worth having a think about running this video on some of your construction sites. This really does start to articulate some of the challenges that we have on the sites that we work on. Let me know if you're having any hearing problems.
It's just like the advert said, Yanni. $2 a month. Right there. Zurich, phones, passports, food and room included.
Thanks, Alex.
It's part of the recruitment process. You want a job? You want to work?
Yeah.
Phones and passports. Just come with us. We'll take care of everything.
Yeah? Okay. When can I start?
Let me change. Keep that first a week.
I'll sort that when we get back in. Who are these guys? Yeah.
A few extra pair of hands. From the same provider who sent us the Polish guys. They'll stop us from slipping further behind.
Hey. You guys, eh? Yeah? Speak English? Yeah? Right, well, we better get you inside and get you some decent footwear. Site induction first, okay? Yeah? Understand me?
What is this?
This is where you sleep.
Where?
Anywhere you like.
The advert said room and food.
This is it.
I'm not staying here.
You came here to work, Yanni. You want a job?
Yeah.
Then keep quiet. Do as you're told. I don't have permit for you yet. Police could arrest you. Send you home. You don't want to let your family down. Your mother, little sister Natasha, you don't want to let them down now, do you? Do you?
No.
You owe us a lot of money, Yanni. Accommodation, food, permits. You work for us now. Now eat. Zašto si zakasno, mamo, jebemo pičku materinu?
Hey, where is my money? 3 months I've been here and nothing. I've got family to feed.
Sit down and eat.
I'm not eating this again. Where is my money? I want it now!
Sit down! What is problem now? Lisa, I brought you here. Huh? I know where your wife and your little girl live. You make problems for me. You make bigger problems for him. You get me? je bij me bogen. Hij die helemaal.
Wow, what happened there? Hey, you didn't do that on site, did you? Hey? Right, come on, clear up. You're making more mess than you're cleaning. Yanni. Yanni. It is Yanni, right? You've been here long? England? You've been in England long? Have you worked in construction before? Have you worked in building?
And now I'm here, my friend. You get me CS card.
Friend?
Yeah, I pay him back the 150 when I get it.
What? £150?
I get it soon, don't worry about it.
Steep, isn't it, eh? Bit expensive.
Paul!
I'll come back.
Hey, what's the score?
You like football?
Yeah.
2-all. Tight game.
You got cigarette?
No.
Just one. I pay for it.
Where did you get this?
Found it. Save it for you.
Come here!
Thank you.
Yeah, police, please. Yeah.
Eat. You shouldn't stay. You get in trouble.
He thinks I've gone for a piece.
Saw an advert in the paper for a job. Why are you here?
Dale, come here! Dale, come here, quick, quick! capable, what?
Darren's asked for the link to that video, which is in the website group chat if you want to take that on. That, thank you, Steve. It is quite powerful. I've watched that more times than I can count, and it still has that little bit of a impact, even for me. That's probably my 50th or 60th time of watching it. What's really quite powerful in there is the fact that when I first started doing lots of training around modern slavery, people were asking me what checks to do. And it was all about, do I check passports? Do I check bank accounts? Do I check telephone numbers? Do I check? And yes, you do. You check all of those. The reality is that criminals are not stupid. They know how to bypass checks that you put in place, and they know how to change if they need to. So one of the signs that you used to be able to check was bank accounts. Have you got more than one person on the same bank account? I was listening to a presentation by Justine Carell, who runs the Modern Slavery Helpline, and she said they don't do that anymore. They know now that that's a check that people use, that's a check that businesses use. So actually, each individual might have 10 bank accounts opened in their name, but there will be individual bank accounts. So bank account checks suddenly become a bit more difficult to look at. There are things you can do like right to work, but what I think is quite powerful in that video is that it wasn't those checks, it wasn't the paperwork, it wasn't the tick boxes that we tend to do. It was the fact that fundamentally the site manager realised something was wrong and started to just gently ask questions. It's important that you start to think about your sites and how you work and where that responsibility lies. So if you haven't done any training to any of your site teams, they are your eyes and ears. They are the first line of defence in terms of helping victims and protecting your business. So think about getting those guys trained. That's a very long video, but very, very powerful. There is also in the school, and you can find that video on the school along with a large number, but you can also find a 1-minute video that does a very simple job of explaining those signs, which you could run during a lunchtime or just a toolbox talk briefing just to get people to think about it. But the key is to get your guys and girls on site to understand what to look for. And you know, we saw it in there. Physical and psychological abuse, the fear that these individuals go through. What was really interesting from the discussion that I had with the supply chain director probably about 3 years ago, when they found somebody on site who was a security guard. He was working at Christmas and he was working in a porter cabin, and he was left unattended for 4 days. They found him 4 days later, and he turned up on site on a Saturday. He got a bottle of water and a loaf of bread, turned up for shift. Somebody happened to be passing and he was still in there on a Wednesday, obviously hadn't left. He was in a sleeping bag underneath the desk. The water was being filled up from the tap in the porter cabin, and he got about, probably about 1/6 of his loaf of bread left. That's what he'd been eating. The interesting thing is that the psychological abuse that they put these people under was that he stayed there. He didn't leave. He had every opportunity to run and didn't. So they're under both a physical and a mental strain, and you saw that from the controlling mechanisms. They may look malnourished and unkempt. Apologies to Arsenal fans on this right now, but I spoke to a taxi driver a while ago who used to work for a very, very large housing company, and he said he'd been on a training course and thinks that he may work with somebody. And the thing that triggered it for him was this individual kept turning up with the same Arsenal shirt every day. And what they used to do through the banter was rip the nick out of him about being the worst Arsenal fan on, you know, needed a wash, change your shirt, come on, they haven't done well. As far as he was concerned, it was banter, but this person had no more clothes. They had nothing else to wear. So they were turning up in the same thing every single time. There may be hygiene issues, they may be tired, they will not actually converse. And what was quite interesting with that one as well was there was 2 of them who lived in the same house who didn't even make eye contact with each other. So they won't even acknowledge if there's anyone else on their sites working with them. They keep very, very low profile and very siloed and very introverted. So learning these signs is as important as learning the checklist, because by putting both of them together, you have a better idea of understanding what the victims are and how it operates. The other issue is also to then remember that these people are vulnerable. When I talked about Operation Fort, that was at the beginning of this year, notice where I said they came from. They came from prison, they came from homeless shelters, they came from shopping centres where they were just sort of spending all their time, they didn't have work. They are vulnerable. There's a massive increase in campaign at the moment with the Samaritans and Salvation Army going around the homeless at the moment in the UK, making sure they understand that if a white van pulls up and offers them a job and a house and a place to live, that is going to be too good to be true, because they won't be there to help. They'll be there to then bring them in off the street and into an environment that actually you could even argue is worse than where they were living. So it comes to something when actually the safest place to live is the streets rather than with your exploiters. So the vulnerabilities are really, really important. When we talk about poor English, yes, we're looking at obviously immigrants that come into the country. Not every immigrant is illegal. They may be legal and exploited. Not every illegal immigrant is an exploited individual. There is a correlation, but they're not necessarily a one-for-one. So don't make that mistake in thinking that. But poor English skills could also be UK-based. Individuals with bad reading skills, lack of education and knowledge. I was talking to Frank Hansen, who's the new head of GLAA in the sector that we're operating in, and they're working on an apprentice scheme at the moment to teach people the basics around employment law, what their rights are, how to read, how to write, how to make sure that maybe some of the people who are vulnerable because of their education levels understand what is good and what is bad practice around their own internal employment rights, how to read pay slips, all that sort of basic stuff. So vulnerability is the key here. It's the thing that they use to exploit them. If you do manage to educate your site teams and you do come across a victim, don't ring me. I mean, it's great you do, but I can't help. Think about how you manage your victims. Think about how your whistleblowing works. Think about what activities. There may be some of you on here that don't want the hassle. There'll be nervousness and trepidation about getting involved. And actually, I think the actor on the site played it very, very well. He was very nervous about ringing the police. He didn't understand whether he wanted to get into that situation or he didn't. You could be talking to organised crime here. So there's a few things to remember. If you use things like the Modern Slavery Helpline, it's anonymous. So Unseen, who run the Modern Slavery Helpline, any reporting in using either the app or via the phone is anonymous. You don't have to give your name. The information goes into intelligence in the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority, and they don't care who reported it. What they then do is bring all of that together to create then the case. So at no point would you necessarily have to then go to court or understand and testify. So again, you can have an element of comfort that you might not have to get involved in the whole process. What happens is that the GLAA take that information, they then pool it with other sources of information, and they work out a strategy on how they're going to help that individual victim. So you have a role to play, but you don't have to take them home. You don't have to look after them. You don't have to tell them it's all better. And in fact, I recommend don't doing that, because the psychological profile of a lot of these people, you are not going to be prepared to deal with. You are not going to be armed. They need the right help from the right people. So when you find a victim, managing your victim is really, really important. As an organisation, in any due diligence system you put in place, you need to think about what's the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that could happen is you suddenly find out you've inadvertently employed somebody who's exploited. What does that mean for your business? What does that mean for you? What does that mean for the victim? So think about the worst case. And we've done it. We've all got Brexit on our minds at the moment, possibly more than COVID, less than COVID. We're all thinking about worst scenarios at the moment. Just take that thinking and think about that in terms of the victim profile and create that plan on how it works. A good thing to do is to raise awareness in your organisation, create champions, create people who are genuinely interested in trying to deal with these issues and have a good way of understanding that people dynamic. Make sure you've got a point of contact, somebody who is sort of responsible that people can go to. We talk about champions, that's an old-fashioned concept, but it's a good one to use. Think about creating sort of champions who can really help raise awareness, have those conversations. And then obviously make sure that when you're doing this, you understand all the intricacies around trafficking, around the issues of exploitation and how it happens. Intelligence is key in this, so to get as much of that as you can. And those individuals need to have a good level of understanding, understanding what's going on, understand the mannerisms, all of those sorts of issues. If you do find a victim, here's some advice on how to handle them. A lot of this is common sense, but just be aware of the fragile situation you could find yourself in and those individuals. Take them to somewhere safe. And by that, I don't mean take them to a nice big glass walled office and sit them in the middle and start interviewing them. Take them somewhere where they're away from everybody, that you can talk to them. Make sure they're comfortable, that they've got food and water, and that they're warm, and that they feel comfortable and safe. They will not feel safe, they will be scared. So making sure that you can actually talk to them. The interesting thing with the video that we saw with the concrete was obviously he spoke to them in a very open environment. He was having general chats. They will be looked at and watched. So just be mindful that if you do find somebody, have other conversations with other people as well, so it doesn't look like you're picking somebody out. Just make sure that they're comfortable, that they can speak to you, but it doesn't look like you're picking on them. Make sure they have access to medical help. Be aware of things like PTSD, depression, stress, lack of communication, all those sorts of issues. So think about how you would deal with all of that. And then do what we do best in this industry. Take lots of notes, get lots of evidence, get lots of paperwork, because there's not only the prosecution that you have to think about here around how the victims are given support, but actually how do you go back to your business and find out how the hell this happened? How do you go back to your business and make sure that it doesn't happen again? How do you take all that information and get that lessons learned to ensure that it doesn't happen at another point? So make sure you're capturing all the documentation, all the evidence, and that you've got a process internally for reviewing why it happened and how you can make sure it doesn't again. Take notes, give the victim as much support and information as you can, but don't overpromise. And then obviously get them in touch very, very quickly when you can with the law enforcement, with 999, with GLA, with the Modern Slavery Helpline, whatever your selection choice is. But they need to be sort of connected with those guys as quickly as possible. And the reason is because organisations like Modern Slavery Helpline and the GLAA do the whole prosecution, helping the victim. They have the whole pot of tools available. So they do a lot of work within this space, and they assume responsibility for that individual. They take them, they look after them, they put them in safe houses, they make sure that they're looked protected, and obviously then bring the case to court if they can capture the exploiters. So that's sort of how you go around doing things. Now, there is something in the school which I'll send a link out to called the AIR model, which we've created, and it's awareness, investigation and response. And it's a guidance sheet that we've created that helps you think about how you set your sites up. And it's a huge, huge wealth of resources. Here's some posters, here's some induction videos, here's some right to work checks, here's some checklists. I'm going to send that around to you when we send the slides around, because if you're thinking about then how you get that message out to your lads and ladies on site, then this is a good way of doing it. And in this space, you don't have to pay for a lot. There is so much free information out there. So we've put that all into a nice little guidance for you in terms of how you set up your sites. And if you're working on a site for SRM, sorry Alice, and they haven't done it, then go back to them and tell them that needs to be done, and give them some information in that space. Okay. Final thing, that's sort of an overview really of what we'll go into in a bit more, well, a lot more detail in December, is the fact that every organisation has to have due diligence in place. What we've hopefully been able to articulate in the videos and things that we've shown you so far is it doesn't matter whether you're an SRM or whether you're a tier 3 one-man band landscaping company, you have to have the right due diligence in place. It has to be proportionate. So we're not expecting the one-man band landscaping company to have a 50-page document on what they're doing around human trafficking. But we would expect something like that of, you know, SRM, for example. But you have to have processes in place to protect yourself. And due diligence is the way. Now, I'm a simple beast, and I've heard the words due diligence so many times. Like, what the hell is that? What is due diligence? And fundamentally, it's a way to protect yourselves. It's a number of steps. It's a system that you put in place to make sure you're not breaking the law, and that you cannot be prosecuted. So the good old-fashioned English dictionary can give you a definition in that space. There is one now relating to human rights, so overlay that what you're doing in terms of human rights breaches and labour standards, and in fact, there is the Modern Slavery Act, but there will soon be new human rights due diligence legislation coming through. We don't know what that looks like yet, but when that comes, that will start to overlay these aspects. And basically what it's doing is putting onus on you guys, regardless of where you sit in the supply chain, to make sure that you're taking all the necessary steps to identify any breaches or instances of modern slavery in your operations and your supply chains. When we do the due diligence course in December, there will be an element of don't panic. It's about understanding where your influence sits, but it's important that you do understand that wherever you sit, you have a role to play in getting those supply chains to become more transparent. Marshals, who I talk about a lot, who are very exemplary in this space in terms of how they handle this, and that's because they work in mines in Vietnam, in Laos, places that have massive human rights issues. He is very open and honest that it's not about saying at any point, we have no slaves. It's impossible for anybody to say that you have 0 slaves in your supply chain. And to be honest, these days, if you do say that, everyone will know you haven't looked. What it's about is saying, we know that we've probably got it somewhere. If we find it, we will fix it. And we're looking where we can. So the find and fix philosophy is a good way of looking at it. Where your influence is, then we can have a look at that. In terms of things that you need to think about from an organisational due diligence perspective, every business needs to have somebody accountable and responsible. Accountable should be the highest level. Your board should be accountable for this, but responsibility is everybody. There's a very interesting debate that goes on amongst organisations that are looking at this. It's not about who do I go and pass the buck to. Everybody has a role to play. You all have eyes, you all have ears, you all have suspicions. It's your responsibility to make sure that you are raising those where you possibly can. So everyone has a role to play, both organisationally and individually. It's about making sure that you have training in place, and we go into the due diligence course later on about what we mean by training. As much as I've seen a lot of you haven't fallen asleep, that have got your cameras on, which is good. It's about trying to avoid what we call the sheep dip training. Just shove them all on this course and then go away and tell them they know what they're doing. It's about making sure if I'm talking to site teams, they've got training that's relevant to them. If I go and talk to procurement, would expect them to know more. If we talk to the boards, their training needs to be even more in depth and understanding what the business case is. There is measurement and reporting, so action plans on what you're doing and how you're really trying to address this and then measure it and evidence it. And here's a hint: if any of you've got bids that need to evidence what you're doing, that sort of data really starts to get you extra points in submissions and how you're dealing with these things. As I've mentioned before, and again, we delve further into this, you do a risk-based approach. So focus on what you can influence, focus on what you can do better, focus on what your risk is to you, and obviously what risk you have for the supplier, for your client. So you are not expected to take a broad brush. In fact, you will end up becoming inefficient if you do that. So it's about focusing on where you can make a difference and focusing on those risks. And then engaging in the stakeholder community. Talk to your competitors, talk to your peer organisations, talk to NGOs, talk to your client. I was called idealistic yesterday by somebody when it came to this, but actually fundamentally the only way we can deal with this problem is together. That sounds so corny, doesn't it? But it's true. From a perspective of how we deal with these issues, it's not a competitive space. There should never ever be a tender from any of your clients that put weightings and tender competitive prices against what we're doing here. This is about how do we combat organisations' risks around exploitation. And a lot of this is about not reinventing wheels. So just talk, find out what other organisations are doing, find out how we can actually start to improve things more collectively. Whereas I appreciate other aspects of sustainability are a bit more competitive, a bit more sort of sensitive in that bid space. This isn't. So speak to anyone you can, and we can go through some of those in the session we do in December. And then there's good old procurement, who have to do everything, seriously. But we have the challenges around supply chain. How do we make sure that we are getting our supply chain to do it? And it isn't just about terms and conditions. It isn't just about what I put in my pre-qualification. It's a lot more about the supply chain management. And again, how we connect the dots. We will not get transparency in our supply chain. We will not understand where the bricks are coming from South Asia until we start to connect the chains in that supply chain. And a brilliant analogy I've used in my procurement experience is that within construction now, it's no longer about who's the best supplier. It's about who's the best supply chain. Because actually, if a link in your supply chain breaks, the whole project falls apart. And we are getting better at understanding that now within this industry. And then a lot of areas that very, very few businesses are currently doing in any shape or form well is remediation. If I find somebody, what do we do? The basics at the moment for most organisations is I hand them to police and they get on with it. But remediation can go as sophisticated as, and we'll talk about it again later on in the workshop that we're doing in December. The best example we've seen of this is Brighter Futures, who are a co-op organisation who actually offer jobs to victims. They really look after them all the way through the processes, to, you know, the most basic being ensuring that they're getting in touch with the right organisations. So those are the sorts of things to have a think about in terms of what your organisation has in place. Does your organisation have any of this? And again, I have a checklist that I need to be, that I will send, that goes through those due diligence pieces. So I'll make sure that we can send some links to those documents where they can. So I'm going to have a break now, and I'm going to pass you over to Alice, who just chooses this moment to sneeze. She's going to talk about what Sir Robert McAlpine. So just tell me to click, Alice, when you need me to.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Helen. I think I'm Alice Hands. I will know many of you, and I know many of you on the call. I haven't met all of you, but thank you for joining, and thank you for taking part in this. What I want to say, and Helen, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah. What I want to say is, what Helen's gone through is fantastic, but I will put my hand on my heart and say we're not doing all of that perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. So I just want you, it's about, I thought I'd give you a bit of an introduction into what we've done over the past few years, where you, our supply chain partners, have fed into that, and what we're looking to towards in the future. But we are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So, and I think that's really good to sort of be honest about, because this is a really in-depth topic, and the more we look into it, the more I think, oh my gosh, we need to do X, Y, and Z. But it is about doing things as you can, and just starting that process as well. So in terms of, since 2016, which is where we started to really gear up, obviously post 2015 when the Act came out, we very crudely split our risk into our UK site labour and the sort of material supply chain. Now, our focus has been predominantly on the UK site labour piece. That is not to say that the global, obviously, material supply chain isn't important. It is equally important. But the reason we've been focusing on our UK site labour is because, A, I think that's where a lot of the unawareness, and we didn't realise it was potentially an issue before the Act. And so there was a lot of ground to make up on that. And also that's where our leverage is most strongest. There are sites, these people, even if they don't work, you know, most of the people that work on our sites do not work for us directly, obviously, but there are sites we are responsible for their well-being. So our leverage is much greater. What I would say is often a lot of our clients are asking around the material supply chain. So just be aware of that, because we have got to engage with that more than we do at the moment. And that will be, again, obviously working with you on that. So what we started with was one of our big clients in London was also engaged on this topic. And they actually did a what we call a site engagement survey on one of our sites in London. And that really opened our eyes up to the land. And from that point, we have started looking at our supply chain through the lens of exploitation and modern slavery, which we hadn't done before. And we hadn't looked at it through that lens. And because we were looking at it through that lens, we were learning things about our supply chain, things that we had no idea about before, I'll be really honest. And we've learned so much over the last few years by looking at it through that particular lens. So I think that's really important. Over the years, the things that we've done around collaboration and the rest of the industries, there's the GLA construction protocol, which is out there, and it's very much about working together. Now, I will be honest, you can kind of sign up to the protocol and you can be as inactive or as active as you want. And I think there's a bit of a feeling that it needs to be a bit more tangible, but it is a good forum for going and sharing things, for learning and hearing what other people are doing. And you can pick up quite a lot of good tips from it in that sense. We've been doing this audit program with Achilles, who many of you have been involved with. And my next slide, which don't move on quite yet, Helen, goes into those two different audits that we've been looking at. And I thought I'd give you just a bit more insight. But since sort of 2017, we've really ramped that program up. It's been paused this year, obviously because of COVID. We can't carry them out like we wanted to, but we are re-engaging with, as of November, on that. And that, again, has been really a powerful sort of tool for us. Now, what I would say is it's only one tool that we've been using to look at this remit. There is a lot of, I think, audit fatigue. There's a lot of criticism over audits in general. But what I would say is, at the moment, these audits and these assessments are giving us an insight into supply chain that we hadn't had before. We're learning things and we are finding things. So as long as we continue to do that, we will continue to use them. When it gets to a point that we're not gaining anything from them, that's when we will ask, well, are they effective? But they are giving us knowledge, and they are raising issues, and they're also giving us that view of the supply chain as even more as to why construction can be high risk. So they are serving a purpose at this point in time. We are starting, since sort of 2019, we've started, and some of you will know, we've started to look past just you, our tier ones, and we're starting to go into the tier twos, because what we understand is the risk of slavery and exploitation, McAlpine, is obviously very small. The risk in you guys is very small. It's as we go down into that supply chain where that risk suddenly ramps up. So, and some of you we've been working with, sort of bringing in your either labour providers or other subcontractors that you use. But what I hope you've realised from that, and for those that we've engaged with, we try and bring you on that journey with us. We also attend the sort of assessments and audits with Achilles, because this programme isn't just about us putting another sort of giving you something else to do. We want to collaborate with you, and hopefully for those that have been through it, we've had quite some good conversations, and it's not simply about us putting another sort of process for you to go through. It's a program that we pay for, and that's what we've also seen with some of our clients. Some of our really engaged clients will also engage in things like that, but they take on that cost, and they take on that risk. And I think that's really important when you're talking about this subject. It's not simply about just passing the obligations and the risk down through our supply chains. It's about each and every one of us owning that responsibility and acknowledging that we all have a part to play in it. Some of the things that we've done internally in SRM, we've got a bit of an online portal on SR Online where we've put information around what we're doing. We put a bit of information around the Act. We put a bit of information around things that we go through the BES 6002, which is the ethical labour sourcing verification ourselves. Putting about our audits, and we've got like a resource section where we've got links to supply chain school. We've got links to a few other things like Stronger Together. There's a CIOB report out there, so it's a bit of a hub for people in our organisation to go on, and they can have a sort of flick through, and they can understand what we're doing. Because even though we obviously talk to our people about our modern slavery statement, we engage with them on that. You know, it's very hard to get that message all the way down just through your own organisation. So we find doing sort of shorter engagement things on using multiple different communication channels more effective than just obviously sending out our statement every year. Helen, if you switch on to my next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So just to give you, again, some of you have been through this with us, but the two types of audit. We do a labour practice assessment where we go in and we talk to you about your processes and procedures. That often looks at legal compliance, but it obviously goes beyond that. And that sort of, for us, again, as I said, we often come along with Achilles to it. I've used it as an engagement tool to hopefully raise awareness of modern slavery and exploitation. It's a third-party assessment, so for us, that's a good validation of what we're doing. I think if we came in ourselves and just sort of looked at you, that there's a conflict of interest there, or there's a bias. But also it gives you, hopefully, a third-party assessment, and it gives you something that you can use around if you're writing about your modern slavery statement, and it can give you some areas of improvement. And we've gone through it ourselves as well. So it's not just about us putting it down onto our supply chain. And also we can, you can use it as a plan to sort of monitor and improve. But it works very well with the site engagement survey. So that's again something that we ask our third party. They will go onto sites, and they will, before COVID, they used to go into the canteen area, and they used to spend about 3/4 of the day talking to all the operatives on site, asking them if they'd take part in a 5-minute sort of anonymous questionnaire. They don't take their name, but they do ask who they work for. So again, if issues do start, or potential issues start to rise, we know who to contact. Those two work very well together, and we use them together. I'll be really open about that. So we might go into we might have a site engagement survey, and there might be some issues coming up, which we think, okay, and we'll go and then contact the applicable supply chain partner. Or we might come out of a labour practice audit and think that looks great, but let's actually see how that works in practice. And I think that relates back to Helen's comment around audits. You can have everything, all your processes and procedures in place, but it is about getting out into your supply chains. And that's where we use these engagement surveys. We can actually talk to people on our sites. So, you know, if someone has a particular procedure, great. Is it actually filtered down through that business and enacted on site? And the site engagement survey, that's where we've really built a picture around the sort of levels of our supply chain. And we realized how much sort of subcontracting, especially around the labour area, that is. And we've learnt lots around that. And it's given us quite a sort of vivid picture of that level. So they work very well together. That's obviously where quite a lot of you have engaged with me on this topic. But we are continuing to do them. We've picked up again as of November, and they are hopefully a useful tool, not just for us, but for yourselves as well. So if you move on, Helen. So what have we, some of the things that we've discussed, you know, we've learned so far is right to work checks. And again, right to work checks on their own aren't a sign of exploitation, but there's something, to be honest, that we sort of picked up, I suppose by chance, but one of the things we found is right to work checks down through the supply chain don't always happen as they should. Normally it's around the actual ID document hasn't been seen. It's like a photocopy, or the checks are happening on the first day of employment. Now, technically, you have to do that check before someone is employed, not on the first day of employment. And we actually got a visit. Those of you who work on our Battersea site last summer, we had a visit by immigration where they did a sweep. And we had people on that site who did not have the right to work. I got my words mixed up there. And I think there's a question on that from, is it Kathleen, around if you are weeding out potential victims, right to work checks, are we essentially diverting them elsewhere? I think you've got to do it. It's a legal check that you've got to do. What I would say is, if you're getting a pattern through from a particular company that you're engaging with, and those people haven't got the right work check, or a particular agency, flag that, because that's a pattern, and that's what you might want to flag with someone like the GLAA or Unseen, because you might have a pattern coming through there if they're coming from a similar sort of organizational network. So that's what I would say. You have to do it, and you can't put people to work that don't have the right to work. But if you are seeing patterns or coming through, I would flag it with people like the GLAA. So self-employment route. Obviously, a lot of people are on our sites are employed by the self-employment route. That's not a problem. But as Helen said, we have to admit that the level of subcontracting and also the self-employment route does mean that our industry is more opaque, and therefore that can enable exploitators to act greater or to sort of have more freedom. Where we think it's also important is, often we found those that are self-employed obviously don't often have access to a grievance mechanism or whistleblowing policy, or they don't know about the policies that the company they're engaged through have. Why is that important? It's just a policy. Well, a policy is about what a business stands for, and often in a policy, that's where their whistleblowing helpline or their if you've got a worry, how would you raise it? So all I would think about is with the people that you're bringing on site, don't just think about your directly employed staff. Think about also people that you're engaging with, because from a health and safety perspective, you have to. And ultimately, when we're talking about exploitation, we are talking about the health and safety of an individual and their well-being. So it is no different. So they should also have a way and feel comfortable about a way of raising a concern. As I said, in terms of the risk, it's often past the tier 1. That's where the lack of due diligence falls off the radar, where we've seen it. And we have generated our own labour code of conduct, which addresses some of the key issues that we've seen from the work that we have done. And again, hopefully most of you would have been contacted about that. So Helen, if you move on to the next slide. Thank you. So all I want to say was, from our perspective and some learnings that we've had, if you're thinking, okay, where do I start, or we've stalled a bit, education, I think, is the first point. Educate your people on the topic. You empower them by doing that, and that's how you get that conversation going. And there are so many free tools out there that Supply Chain School have, so you do not have to reinvent the wheel, but start with education. provide an avenue for raising concerns, because obviously when you educate people, people will obviously start looking at it and look at their work environment and their workforce through a slightly different lens, and they will start to have concerns probably. So make sure you've got an avenue for them to raise that, or they at least know who to go to talk to, and you can intertwine that as part of your training. Risk profile your supply chain. Again, this isn't a perfect science. One person will risk profile the supply chain, another person will, and they'll have a completely, could have a completely different set of results. But start with that. And we started small, and that just gave us an idea of what we thought our key risks were. And it was around doing research on the topic, it was around what we knew already. But by then getting out in our supply chain, we understood a lot more, and that has kind of fed back into our strategy. As I said, engage your supply chain on the topic, so hopefully that's what we're doing now, but have those conversations. It links back to the sort of education and awareness piece. And as I said previously, start small. Don't think I've got X number of suppliers, I've got to look at all of them now. You will get, it's too much. Start small, start where you think your biggest risks are, and that will help feed into your strategy going forward. Okay, thanks, Helen. That was a bit of a run through where we are, but hopefully it's given you a bit of an idea where SRM are and why we're sort of engaging with you on this topic.
Brilliant, thanks Alice. And I think that shows me the fact that this is not, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's something that needs to happen over a long period of time. We're not looking for any organisation to tick boxes. Tick boxes don't change things. This is about slowly and surely deciding how you're going to make that change necessary to look after your people. Yes, that's slightly idealistic, but it's about looking after people. And if you're concerned as to why we would do that, because the industry's always operated quite nicely, I think it's something like 100,000 new entrants, or between 80,000 to 100,000 new entrants we need into this industry. And guess what? When you interview a lot of the younger generation and ask them whether they want to come and work in construction, I think a survey was done last year, only 7% of school leavers even thought about construction as an industry, because we're seen as a pretty horrible place to work. So even if you're not thinking about exploitation, you're thinking about the business case, looking after how we deal with these issues, how we deal with some of the underlying issues has bigger ramifications than just exploitation, although that's pretty serious enough. But thinking about the fact that, as an industry, we need to be getting better to make sure that we can keep going, effectively. So very, very quickly before the end, as we've mentioned, there is a lot of support. Alice has already mentioned the construction protocol. So if you have not signed up to that yet, do go and have a look at it. There is a wealth of resource on the school, so there is possibly even too much, but I will attach to the email that I sent to Sophie to send out a load of useful links, some of the videos from today, but also some of the documentation that it's worth having a look at. But there's e-learning modules, there's guidance documentation if you prefer reading. If you don't like reading, there's videos. So whatever your way of educating is, there's a lot of different types of things that you can access. As I mentioned in there's a couple of new things that you can go and have a look at. So we have the due diligence checklist that you can use. So that takes all those aspects that I talked about in that due diligence structure and gives you a picture about what you should see. So what does a good policy look like? What does good training look like? What does risk assessment look like? How does that work? So it gives you, it literally gives you the answer to a certain extent of what to do, so go and have a look at. And I mentioned that setting up your site, so advice on how to be able to do that at site level, so we'll send all that out. If you have responsibility for evaluating a modern slavery statement and don't know whether it looks good or bad, we put evaluation criteria for you, so that not only are you asking have you got a statement, but you're actually looking at it and analysing it too, which is quite useful. It's not a compliance tick, but you can really get to grips with these things. We haven't even touched really on the integrated issues that are associated with modern slavery, but for those of you who aren't aware, we've created something called the People Matter Charter. We have 68 signatories now. 2 clients, National Grid and Scape, have signed up. We're currently talking to HS2 and Highways England about signing, and what this is a commitment from an organisational perspective that you are working at all the things that deal with people. And they are all interconnected. So we've mentioned, slavery happens when you've got bad payment around wages or bad payment mechanisms with breaches in tax or umbrella companies. And skills doesn't happen if you've not got good EDI. This is a strategy that's worth having a think about and signing up to. I believe SRM are signatories, even though they didn't put it in that slide deck, in terms of using that. And what we're looking for is eventually that we've got clients, that we have tier 1s, that we have tier 2s, so we can start to get that consistency of standards. So if you're interested in more details, the link's there. Just drop me an email because it's all starting to make those small changes necessary. We have an event on the 24th of November that is worth thinking about. So we talked a lot about what happens if you find somebody. So on the 24th of November, we have the GLAA, we have Slave Free Alliance, we have Modern Slavery Helpline, and I'm just trying to get somebody from HS2 and SCS to talk about the Brighter Futures. And this is all about what you do if you find a victim and what support they get. So it's a bit of an event like this, although you won't hear from me quite so much, you'll be pleased to hear. We'll have lots of other different presenters. And I mentioned the due diligence. There's a due diligence workshop that we're running on the 10th of December. There will be limited places on that one because it will be more me interacting with you rather than me talking at you. But the information will come out from Alice to allow you to do that. So that gives me a grand total of about 3 minutes to answer any questions that are in there. One thing to remind you is that Sophie will probably send around a link with all the slides, with all the links and everything that you need, but please feedback, fill out the SurveyMonkey. It literally will take you about a minute of your time, maybe 2 if you're slow typer. But we do need to understand what could be better and what doesn't need a lot of. So please share your feedback if you can. In terms of questions, I have one that we've not answered. So thank you, Alice, for answering Kathleen's question. Yes, the diverting them is a risk, unfortunately. So it's about not just finding them, but then having an active action of what to do to help them to make sure they don't go somewhere else. But Martin's question about Brexit occurring and rights to work changing and foreseeing a problem with people who currently have a right to work here being potential victims of slavery as they're no longer eligible to work here. Big fat yes, basically. And it's not just people here, but the reality is that regardless of what your political bent is towards whether Brexit was a good idea or not, it's not going to stop people wanting to come into the UK. And we've seen that already from the number of people that are being smuggled via fishing ships at the moment into the UK. What it does is it hands them nicely to controllers, and then they get smuggled in. So it's worth bearing that in mind. It's not going to make the problem go away. And in fact, with the skills shortage, it might make it worse.
And Helen, I think just jumping in there about what you said about vulnerability is, I think most people who get it, are exploited at some point. The one thing they have in common is they're vulnerable, and that vulnerability might be different, but they have an element of vulnerability to them. And so back to your question, Martin, about that, if someone is finding it difficult to continue to work here because of obviously the changes, that makes them vulnerable. They might not have been in the vulnerability category, but they then are. Yeah, they are. Even and I think we've seen that with COVID. To be honest, COVID has shone a light on people who are vulnerable, and it's increased that vulnerability for people who were already vulnerable, but it's put more people into that vulnerable category. So with COVID, Brexit, everything is that perfect storm that Helen spoke about.
Yeah, definitely. So just be aware your risk might increase. So it's even more important now to be thinking about your due diligence. Thank you, Sophie. You've put the link there for the SurveyMonkey, but that will go around after the session as well. So if you do have a chance to complete, that's great. And there are going to be some links when we send the videos around. If you're a bit boring like me, you click on one and find 6 more to access. But there is a wealth of information out there, possibly too much, but just go and have a bit of a look. So what I'm going to finish with now for the last minute is the reason that we're here, and hopefully a bit of an overview now of what you can see.
Think about your construction project. Countless people are working on it, and you're making important decisions, big and small. But if you drill down into the detail, modern slavery hides in the most unexpected places. A door hinge. This is Li Wei, and he makes small metal parts in a factory in China. He works 12 hours a day and hasn't been paid in 6 months. These stone sets. Sunita is 11 and works in a quarry in India. It's all she knows. She's part of a supply chain she can't even see. Your LED lighting system. Emmanuel was kidnapped and forced to mine rare metals in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He'll never see his family again, but those rare metals are used in your LEDs. The workers on your site. Andre comes from Albania. Dave's from the UK. They are both victims of forced labor. They're cold and hungry, but they keep working because their controllers know where their wives and kids live. Modern slavery hurts people all over the world, and it can demolish company reputations. But you have the power to change things. Now you can see all the people in your project. Take a long, hard look at your supply chains. Are you delivering projects you can be proud of? Start today. Go to www.ethicalsourcing.co.uk to find out what you can do next.
Okay, everybody, so just a little bit of a thank you and a bit of a sort of nice wrap up that shows exactly what your supply chain is looking like and what your construction projects really impact. So thank you so much to everybody in the comments around the chat, and thank you for sticking with us. I know there's a lot of you and it can be a bit boring listening to the one person talk, but it's been great interacting with you, some good questions. We'll send the slides, we will send the links, feel free to share anything with Alice or myself. But in the meantime, I think that gets you to about lunchtime, so go and have something to eat and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for McAlpine as well. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Alice.